I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to VLGA Connect, and the second in our series of webinars on the recent housing statement announcement from the state government, tackling Victoria's housing crisis. Today, short stay accommodation taxes, a solution to Victoria's rental housing crisis or a tourism dilemma. My name is Chris Eddy, and it's my pleasure to be your host this afternoon. As people join us, let's do some introductory comments. And firstly, can I, on behalf of the VLGA, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. I'm personally coming to you from the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. A few words about the VLGA, which is bringing you this session today. The VLGA supports councils and councillors to deliver great outcomes for their local communities through high performance and good governance. We're member-run and non-partisan. We aim to provide practical advice, direct support, training, professional development, events, networks and resources to members, and to carry out research, policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of local councils. We're the leading voice for local councils and offer our members the opportunity to realise their true leadership potential and increase their impact. The VLGA's mission is to inspire and enable good governance in councils. For today's webinar, we're using the Zoom webinar functionality throughout the course of the session. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll endeavour to get to them either throughout the discussion or as part of our dedicated Q&A component at the end. The chat function is also open for your use for any commentary or discussion with other attendees today. Feel free to use that as well. Please note the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to all of those who have registered in the next few days. So let's get started with our discussion today. The ongoing housing crisis in Victoria has reignited the discussion on how to effectively regulate short-term rental platforms such as Airbnb. Here are our panellists to have this discussion today. Rachel Hornsby is the founder and director of Hornsby & Co. Rachel founded Hornsby & Co. in 2016 to combine her passion for affordable housing with her knowledge, skills and experience of the development and government and community housing sectors. She has first-hand experience of community housing, having worked for Evolve Housing in Sydney and for Housing Choices Australia in Melbourne, Adelaide and Burnie, Tasmania. Rachel is also a former local government executive, was for a time the Director of Planning and Infrastructure at the City of Kingston. Rachel, good afternoon and welcome to you.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Good to have you here as well. Next on our panel is Felicia Mariani, who's the CEO of the Victorian Tourism Industry Council, the dedicated peak body and leading advocate for Victoria's tourism and events industry. Can I just say VTIC is the body that advocates on behalf of businesses that make up Victoria's vibrant visitor economy for changes that create a path to growth and sustainability. They're committed to building the capacity of the industry in key development areas to see the tourism industry excel and lead the way in excellence on the national front. Hello, Felicia.
Hello, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And last but not least is Councillor Brian Hood, the Mayor of Hepburn Shire. Councillor Hood was elected in October 2020 and was selected by fellow councillors to be Mayor in November 2022. In fact, I think your mayoral term runs out next week, Brian, unless, of course, it gets extended by your colleagues. Brian has held several senior management positions across public and private sector organisations, mostly as a Chief Finance Officer. He's a company director and co-chairs the company that operates the Trentham and District Community Bank. Mayor Hood, thank you for being here.
Chris, good to be here.
And can I just say, before we get into the discussion, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge to you, Councillor Hood, that you've joined us today under the shadow of a heartbreaking tragedy that occurred in your community on the weekend, on Sunday evening, one that's deeply impacted not just the Hepburn, but the Wyndham communities as well. And on behalf of the VLGA and our member councils, we'd like to extend our deepest condolences and sympathy to your community at this difficult time.
Yeah, Chris, that's much appreciated.
The discussion today, as I said, is about the ongoing housing crisis in Victoria. International research findings show that when property owners prioritise tourists over residents, it results in a reduction of available housing, increased rental prices, and fundamental shifts in our neighbourhoods. The Victorian government has announced new regulations on short-stay accommodation, noting that over 36,000 such accommodations have reduced long-term rental availability. While some states have limited the number of nights a dwelling can be used for short stays, Victoria is introducing a 7.5% levy on the revenue of short stay platforms. The motive is to dissuade landlords from transitioning their properties from long-term rentals to tourist accommodations. The levy is estimated to raise $70 million annually, which Homes Victoria will utilise for social and affordable housing. It will be charged to the short stay platforms starting in 2025 and will replace any local government charges. These platforms will then bill the hosts. The levy is being criticised for its size, and the tourism sector anticipates it might cause a decline in tourism. We will discuss all of those points today. And firstly, I want to bring Rachel Hornsby in. Can we talk a bit about the relationship between short-term rentals and the ongoing crisis in terms of housing in Australia? Rachel, is there a relationship?
Well, that's an interesting question, and one that academics are struggling to answer at the moment. I think it's useful just to set a little bit of context for people, and a lot of it might seem obvious, but I think it's worth stating around the difference between housing affordability and affordable housing. So we've got a housing affordability crisis in Australia. You know, there are not enough houses at a price point for people to be able to afford to either pay their rent or their mortgage, and also their other basic needs. So, you know, the cost of travel to commute to work, cost of education, cost of health, all of those sorts of things. So we know that there's an affordability crisis in Australia. And if we look at the stats that came out yesterday, the vacancy rate, the national vacancy rate for renting has dropped to 1.02%, the lowest ever. And that national average actually hides that the vacancy rates are even lower in our capital cities than that. So the really low vacancy rates, the costs of rent are pushed higher because the rent is based on what people are willing to afford to pay. And the income earning potential of an asset increases, which increases the value of that asset, so the dwelling, and that pushes up house prices as well. So that's all happening in the affordability space, regardless of what's happening with short-term rental accommodations. We have that affordability crisis. But we've also got an affordable housing crisis. And while they sound like they're the same thing, housing affordability and affordable housing, they're not. Affordable housing is a term used to describe non-market housing. So that's in Victoria, in the Planning and Environment Act, it talks about housing that's appropriate for the needs of very low and moderate income households. And in order to really, I guess, meet the definition and requirements of affordable housing, and this includes social housing, there needs to be an eligibility requirement. So it's not just for everyone, it's for very low and moderate income households. And in order for that eligibility to be applied, there needs to be an allocation process. So eligibility, allocation, and a rent or price setting mechanism as well. So those three things need to be in place for something to be considered affordable housing, as opposed to just being considered lower cost market housing. And I think this is really key when we come to discussing where and how this levy might be spent, particularly in the regions. So Victoria has the lowest rate of affordable housing of any state or territory in Australia. So at around about 2.4% of housing. And so what we see is this really impacts on people's housing circumstances. We see overcrowding, exploitation of vulnerable people, people staying in housing of last resort, or people experiencing homelessness. And keeping in mind that what we see with rough sleepers is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to homelessness and people in insecure housing. So we've got an affordability crisis, we've got an affordable housing crisis, and particularly in the regions, what we're seeing is an housing availability crisis. So even if the price of the dwelling is affordable to people who want to live and work in the regions, there's just simply not enough houses for people to rent or buy. And I think this is where the greatest link is between short stay accommodation, is this notion of availability in the regions. The regions are disproportionately impacted by short stay rental accommodation. So there's a lot of short stay right in the city. There's not a lot in the middle ring and outer suburbs, but then as a proportion, the regions are significantly overrepresented compared to the city. And so I guess it's against that backdrop that I think talking about short stay housing, short stay accommodation and housing, and the policy and regulatory responses to it, I just think that's really important, because we need to nail down, I think, if we're looking at regulatory intervention, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Are we trying to solve a housing affordability issue, which is more general? Are we trying to tackle housing availability, which is quite a significant issue in the regions in terms of being able to attract and retain employees to those regions and create communities and families be established? Or are we trying to tackle the lack of affordable housing, which is significant and vast in Victoria? Or is it something else, a combination of all of those? So I think that context answers, it's a long way of answering the short question is, are they linked? The truth is they are in some respects, but it depends what segment of the housing market that you're really talking about.
So you talked about defining the problem we're trying to solve, and you gave 3 or 4 different elements of that there. Yeah. Which of those do you think are directly linked to short stay accommodation?
I think the availability is the big issue. So housing in regions is generally more affordable. So, it's not, it doesn't have the same issues of housing affordability that we see in the cities. But the availability is really low. And there's sort of a catch-22 as well, because the values of properties in the regions tend to be lower. There's less incentive to build new houses in the regions because there's not the same return, and the banks are less likely to lend money to put in all the infrastructure and build the houses. So for the limited housing stock that exists, when that housing stock moves from long-term rentals into short stay accommodation, I think there is a link there. What we don't have a lot of good evidence on is would those houses, if you bring in an intervention like 7.5%, would that push those houses back into the long-term rental market, or would they transfer to first home buyers, or would something else happen? It's one of those things that theoretically it seems like a close link and an easy fix, but in practice, I'm not sure that when we did the work with Hepburn Shire, the feedback that we got from short stay accommodation providers was that they wouldn't turn their house into long-term rental if it stopped being short stay accommodation, that they wanted to be able to use their house as a holiday home. They wanted to be able to retire to that property in 5 years or 10 years' time. So the holiday house component is really, I think, a big barrier for those properties transitioning into long-term rentals. We don't have the evidence yet that says if this wasn't short stay accommodation, it would automatically become long-term rentals. There will be some movement, but I don't think it's as strong as the narrative is at the moment.
That answers the question I was going to ask you about the evidence, but can we look to overseas at all, perhaps to other jurisdictions? Has this been tried elsewhere and delivered the result that the Victorian government clearly thinks it might?
The research that I've been doing on this, there's a lot of interventions from a regulatory point of view, not so much about a tax, because, and I think to the point about, is this I'm talking about housing, but there's a whole question around the tourism sector and what that sector needs to be supported, and also support the communities in which that activity takes place. The evidence from overseas is that there can be this strong downward pressure on the number of short stay rental accommodations if you put interventions in place. But there's a sort of interventions that would be really unlikely in Australia. So some European jurisdictions have limited the number of short stay rental accommodations in a geographic area. So, you know, like within this town, we will have 100. And that's pretty unusual to find in interventions in Australia. Other places have tried to cap on number of nights. Some places like Amsterdam are really strict. You need a permit even if you want to let somebody rent out your spare room. Some places have a requirement that you have to live locally in order to be able to make your property available. And all those things, if there's the right compliance and monitoring and enforcement, can reduce the number of short stay rental accommodation, which can have downward pressure on house prices and availability. But we're talking about jurisdictions that have much stronger, I guess, history of social and affordable housing, much larger investment in social housing, and a much higher expectation of long-term renters. So quite different, I think, than what we would see play out. Even if you got rid of all the short stay accommodation today, it doesn't fix the affordable housing problem because they're not the same. That's not the same market. It might help a little bit with availability, but as an affordable housing professional, the lack of investment in affordable housing is the issue for affordable housing, not so much so that we're starting to see some private market housing be used in a different way, because that private market housing wouldn't necessarily have been affordable housing anyway under the definition. So
I think that sets the scene nicely in that respect. Thank you, Rachel. I want to bring Felicia into the discussion. Felicia, you're very clearly on the record as someone who's expressed concerns on behalf of the tourism industry about this approach. Can you just tell us why the tourism industry perhaps doesn't agree this is the way to go?
Yeah, I guess the first thing, Chris, I want to say is that we do recognise that we've got a housing crisis here that we need to do something about. I guess as an industry, what we're saying now is that this is not necessarily the right solution. Rachel, can I say that that was the most eloquent explanation that I have heard in this entire debate? And I think you should be like out there singing this song from the rooftops, because the differentials between the affordability, availability, and affordable housing is exactly what I think is being failed to address by this policy. Our position, Chris, has really been very much that taxing the short stay rental market is not going to do a darn thing to discourage property owners from putting their house onto a short-term rental platform. And I want to be very, very clear about something. We keep talking about this as a tax on the short stay platforms. It is not a tax on the short stay platforms. Make no mistake, it is a consumer tax. It is the customer who will pay this tax. There is no impost on the short stay platforms whatsoever, because they're going to recoup that cost. So all these short stay platforms who are raking in billions of dollars and sending them off to Ireland and places overseas to their headquarters will continue to do so. This will do very little to affect the decision of the property owner to load their property on a short stay platform, because again, this is merely a tax that will be passed on to the customer. It's going to be at the bottom of the bill with the cleaning fees and the admin fees and the booking fees, and now you're going to have a 7.5% Victorian state levy. So this is not going to do anything to deter the core problem that we have, which I believe you've again eloquently explained, Rachel, around housing availability. What it is going to do is to make Victoria a far less competitive destination. If I have a choice of staying overnight in an interstate destination where there is no 7.5% tax, or one where there is, that will have an influence. We are already seeing a decline in our total tourism spend in Victoria. We have gone from an average of $4 to $5 billion of quarterly improvement since June 2022 to March 23. And in this last quarter, between March and June, our increase in total tourism spend domestically was only $1.1 billion. That's a significant decrease from the average for the previous year and a bit. And I think this will only get worse. We've just seen another interest rate hike from the Reserve Board on Tuesday. People are tightening their belts. Discretionary spend is being absolutely adversely affected. And let's not forget here, And I said this to a conference I was at the other day. Don't think just because you're in the accommodation sector or not in the accommodation sector that you're not affected by this, because this will affect people's decisions to their length of stay will go from maybe 3 or 4 days to 2 or 3. If you're within a 2-hour halo of Melbourne, I would suggest you should be very worried, because that's day trip territory. So people will start to consider day trip rather than staying overnight, which is a really important part of regional economies, is that overnight stay. It will have an impact on what attractions they visit, what experiences they undertake, whether I eat out or don't eat out, and what local produce do I take home with me from my trip. All of these things will be impacted because consumers are absolutely counting their pennies right now. And the last thing that Victoria needs is roadblocks that are going to make us a more unattractive destination when compared to our interstate rivals.
So, Felicia, we'll come back and unpack that a little bit more. You talk about the levy being a tax on the consumer, not the short stay platforms, because they'll pass it on. And we've got the $70 million estimate fee. I'd like to sort of just unpack what that will buy and whether we agree that that number is about right. But have you done any modelling, or have you got a sense of what the cost to the tourism sector would be in terms of dollars based on the scenario you've just painted?
No, we don't have yet, because this is a bit of an unknown quantity. What I will say, and it was really interesting when you asked Rachel about the overseas case studies, if you will. One of the things that when I looked at what's happening overseas, and Rachel, again, as you noted, there is no jurisdiction in the world that has deliberately set just a tax as the only lever that they will pull to fix this. There's a suite of levers that they are pulling around, as again you said, Rachel, limiting the numbers of days that people can stay. Do they have to get permits? Do we limit the number of short stay properties in a particular jurisdiction? The other interesting point is that many of these jurisdictions, while they might collect a tax of 3, 5, or 7, or even 10%, some portion, if not all of that tax, goes back to the tourism industry. It is hypothecated to the tourism industry to help support their promotion and I guess in some way maybe circumventing some of the implications of what they're doing with short stay properties. So there are valuable lessons to be learned from overseas jurisdictions. I don't honestly believe that we've taken enough time to evaluate what's worked, what hasn't worked, and importantly, what are the unintended consequences of some of these decisions.
I want to bring Brian into the discussion in just a moment, but Felicia, you talk about that disincentive, I guess, for people to spend their money in Victoria, if Victoria is the only one with the levy. We've read media reports that other states are watching pretty closely. Are your colleagues in other parts of Australia of the view that it's just a matter of time when they'll be dealing with the same thing?
They are nervous because they all think this is frankly insanity. They're sitting, my colleagues in my industry are sitting in other states laughing at the moment because they see this as a huge opportunity to really position their destination as more attractive, more affordable. But there is a lot of concern that this could end up getting picked up in other states. And, what does that do overall? I guess at the end of the day, if there was a national strategy here, if there was a national approach to here's what we're going to do as a nation, then we'd go back to a level playing field. But at the moment, while we're standing out there like Robinson Crusoe, we're the only state that has this impost. And this will have an effect on the decision-making process as people start to consider, where am I getting my best value for money?
All right. Thanks, Felicia. We'll come back to you. Let me bring in Mayor Hood from Hepburn. Brian, your council is one of a handful, I think, around the state that have sort of gotten ahead of this and brought in your own plans, strategies, regulations, etc. What does this do for the work that you've done up to this point?
You're correct, Chris. Only recently, just a few months ago, our council adopted our own affordable housing strategy. Now, with the introduction or what's being mooted, we are disappointed and concerned that some of the steps that we were going to be taking to register short-term accommodation premises and regulate their performance and operations, that now seems like we're not really going to be able to do what we had hoped to do. We feel we're being local, we're far better placed to regulate and register and control those sorts of premises. And it is exceptionally relevant for Hepburn Shire. To put that into context, we have 1,300 short-term accommodation premises. Ballarat has 700. Bendigo, City of Greater Bendigo, has 600. We have as much as those two together. And visitation, tourism, day trippers is incredibly important proportionately to our local economy. So there's that factor. And we do, like many others, have a housing crisis as well, right across the Shire, on both availability and affordability.
Do you think your approach that you'd mapped out would deliver a better outcome than what the government's proposing?
That's difficult to say because we can anticipate what we might have been able to do and achieve. It's difficult to project and predict what the government's moves might achieve. But we don't think it's particularly helpful. To state the obvious, in putting our strategy together, we did a significant amount of work on that over quite a long period of time. And we did it in consultation with the local tourism bodies that we're affiliated with. And we did it in conjunction with other affordable housing associations and builders. And with the broader community, we held a number of workshops over quite a period of time. So our strategy was not a hastily cobbled together document. A lot of thought and evidence went into it. So it is concerning that our hands as a local council are now going to be somewhat tied.
So let's talk about the dollars here. Brian, your thoughts on the $70 million estimate and what impact that might have on improving availability of social and affordable housing?
I would be anticipating that might have a fairly modest effect on housing availability. Again, proportionately, we model that, we in Hepburn Shire alone might be contributing more than $9 million through that levy out of that 70. Again, we are a big player. What that does for housing availability and particularly affordable housing remains to be seen. We'd need to see more detail on that to be able to answer that question, Chris.
Rachel, what does $70 million buy you?
Well, if you allow about $500,000 per house, which is possibly a little bit high, that gets you 140 houses for the state, which is not a lot. And if you think about allocating all of those 140 people to the people in the greatest need, and so then you might get a few more because you might end up with some one-bedroom apartments and those sorts of things. You might house, I don't know, you might house 200 households. There might be a couple of people in each household. So you might house 400 people. But what we really heard strongly from Hepburn Shire, from the providers, was that they need housing for the people to work in the tourism sector. Like if this is a tax on tourism, my question is, well, how does it then help support the tourism sector? Because those towns are crying out for market housing. I guess what I'm saying is that the best use of $70 million? And I mean, it's almost sacrilegious for me to say it, given the sector I work in, because I do think there really is a need for affordable housing, but what there actually is a need for housing for workers in these regions. We spoke to accommodation providers whose staff, people who are cleaning their properties had to move to Ballarat, so we're driving an hour and a half to come and clean a property. And the numbers just don't stack up on that. So I think the options for that investment, the $70 million, you could spend it on a small number of social and affordable housing dwellings. Maybe you could spend it on a few more dwellings that could be used for local employees, like key worker housing or local worker housing. But I think we need to keep in mind the impact is always going to be small. That this tax alone will not solve the affordability issue. It won't solve the availability issue. and it surely won't solve the affordable housing issue on its own. And I know that maybe it's about, you know, lots of different opportunities coming together to deliver solutions, but I just wonder if that nexus is really there in this text.
I need to agree wholeheartedly with the points that Rachel is making there. I think she's outlined that very clearly, very well. That's our concern too. And I know we'll speak a little bit later about how the levy is actually structured and where the money proportionately flows to. That is of a concern of itself, a serious one.
Yeah.
Chris, could I
yes.
just jump in on the point of the worker accommodation? I guess we need to keep in mind that running alongside this and unrelated to this levy is within the $2 billion of Commonwealth Games support package that was announced by the government in late July. There is $550 million allocated to regional worker accommodation. So there is essentially a separate, in the mind of government anyway, there's a separate bucket of money that is being allocated for the purposes of building regional accommodation, to speak directly to the pressure that you've identified, Rachel. I guess the big question here is in terms of, is this $70 million going to solve much? I agree. I think it is a drop in the ocean. When you think about the magnitude of the need, I think the unintended consequences are enormous, and I think we will do a lot of damage to an industry that drives $36 billion in economic return to this state, employs nearly 180,000 people, many of them in regional Victoria. So the consequence to gain that little bit of 70 million is going to have a very negative impact on the other side of the scale. The other question I'd be interested in your thoughts on, Rachel, is I'm sitting here watching every day announcements of construction companies that are falling over. How are we actually going to get these houses built, even if we have the money, if we don't have the construction workers in place to be able to build them?
Oh, it's a huge issue for the sector. The construction sector is really hot at the moment, and then when you inject extra funding into that sector, it makes it harder. But ironically, at the same time, we're starting to see building businesses collapse. You know, we've had some significant collapses in the last 6 months. And we're hearing from, I guess, the construction industry that things are difficult, things are tight at the moment. I think there's a big gap between the intended implementation and the actual implementation. And we've seen that with the rollout of the Social Housing Growth Fund. So the big housing build that was announced as a COVID response to what was anticipated to be a real decline in the construction sector. So a lot of funding going into the sector, but seeing that delivery on the ground, you know, significant delays in making that happen, lack of staff to be, workers, trades to be able to deliver. Materials have been an issue, but it's the construction of housing is an issue in of itself, regardless of whether this tax happens or not. Yeah.
I just want to pause for a sec to say the issue of key worker housing will be the subject of our next webinar on this topic. So that's timely. That's coming up on the 24th. I know we've got some Surf Coast councillors in the audience. Surf Coast is also impacted. Mornington Peninsula is another. Bass Coast, etc. Brian, I wonder, is there any dialogue happening with your colleagues in some of those other potentially highly impacted tourism areas about how you might respond to this?
And certainly, Chris, through the MAB, through the Municipal Association Victoria, we've certainly been talking to our colleagues and friends there on this topic, as I imagine other councils are as well, because the ones that you just named, as you quite rightly say, proportionately they're going to be significantly affected by this as well. It affects their local economies so much. And I have on the point of availability. I mean, I've read other articles recently where, in terms of defeating the argument where councils, the finger's been pointed at councils as being slow with planning permits and subdivisions and the like. It does come down to the supply side, that the startups, the amount of construction starting is very, very low at the moment, comparatively low. So it's very convenient for some to point fingers at council saying you're too slow with your approval process, where there's some pretty strong, well quantified evidence showing that startups and on the production side, construction side, is just not happening, and that's where there's a lot of delays on the supply side.
So you talk about the construction industry. Also, Rachel, you might have a view on the state's trying to find 90 new planners as well to work through these processes, and I wonder where they're going to come from.
Yeah, the reality is where they'll probably come from is local government, and then to Brian's point, then everyone will point the finger further at local government. As a former local government employee and as a former planner for my sins, it's really where everybody looks to local government and points the finger at local government. People in the general community are less aware of any planning delays that happen at the state government level. I think it's great that the state's seeking to increase their resources, but unless they're importing a whole bunch of planners from somewhere, it's likely that it will come from local government, and we're likely to see the ripple effect to local government.
Yeah. We'll come to some audience questions in a moment. There's a couple starting to come through. So just a reminder, if you do have a question for our panel, please pop them in the Q&A box or use the chat function. Brian, I want to get your thoughts on the government's proposal that 25% of the levy that's raised will go back to rural and regional councils. And I'm assuming that's 25% across rural and regional, not necessarily 25% back into the council area that the money comes from.
That's our reading of it, Chris, that 75% of the funds raised for the levy would go to metropolitan Melbourne, 25% to anywhere in regional Victoria. Now, again, that strikes us as inequitable. If we're generating, well, whatever the amount of dollars is, but if it's more than $9 million, we would like to see that we, within our own shire, get a reasonable, fair, equitable proportion of those funds to address our specific needs on housing. So the 75-25 split at face value appears to be highly problematic, and I would hope that that's not the end outcome that they settle on.
All right. Thank you, Brian. I have so many more questions, but I do want to give priority to some of these that are coming from the audience as well. Here's one perhaps for you, Felicia. Andy asks about whether anyone's familiar with research on the price elasticity of tourism in Victoria and Australia regarding that argument that higher accommodation costs will discourage tourism.
There we go. Couldn't get off of mute. Look, I don't know of any studies that have been done on the price elasticity, but what I can say to you is that the margins in this industry are very skinny. We might be sitting here as consumers looking at how things are becoming more expensive. You know, when you eat out, the price has gone up, accommodation, flights, everything has gone up. But we have to remember that our tourism business operators around Victoria and around the country are being hit with the same cost of living pressures that we are as individuals. You know, their rents have gone up, their electricity's gone up, their gas has gone up, everything is going up. Their price of supplies, goods and services are going up. So while the prices may look like they're being increased, and that should give us a bit more elasticity, the reality is that the margins are incredibly skinny. And a lot of operators, and again, I think something that we're seeing already happening, and particularly in regional Victoria, a lot of this is due to the fact that they can't get enough staff, but you're finding many tourism businesses that are only open 4 or 5 days a week because they are managing their margins. We used to be a 7-day-a-week business. We were open no matter when you traveled out to regional Victoria. You'd find a place to eat, you'd find a place to do something. If you travel to regional Victoria now on a Sunday or Monday, good luck to you. You better pack a lunch, because most of the restaurants, if you can find anything open after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you're very fortunate. So we are running into real problems because of, you know, there are supply chain issues, there are staffing issues, and there is this whole idea of managing margins, which is really pushing industry to change its business model and change its operation. So I would say that the elasticity is, you know, the rubber band is stretched pretty far.
So Councillor Bodsworth from Surf Coast is asking the question, isn't poor tourism planning partly to blame here?
That's a really good question, and something that I have said for a very, very, very long time. And I think we have to go all the way back to many, many years ago to understand why places like Airbnb got such a stranglehold or a stronghold across regional destinations. And that is purely because, again, tourism planning processes have been and still are impossible for our industry to deal with. And this has had a negative impact on the ability of accommodation properties to improve their offering, to expand, or indeed to get some new accommodation into a lot of our regional areas. And as a consequence of the accommodation sector regionally not being able to keep pace with expectations of the customer, emerged the share economy. Now, I have to also say the other side of this equation is that successive governments in this country at a state and a federal level have failed to deal with the issues of the share economy. We talked about these issues 5 years ago, that Airbnb was going to have exactly the issues that we're dealing with today. And I can tell you personally, I was told by many people in government, we don't intervene in this space, market forces will take care of itself. And we have watched, it started first of all with the taxi industry and the failure to address the share economy. Then it moved to the gig economy and the injustices to the people that work in that. And now we're dealing with the social issues of too much housing on short stay platforms. These were issues that our industry talked about 5-6 years ago, and no one wanted to deal with it. So there are a whole lot of issues that no one wants to go back and understand what it is that we're actually dealing with. And my other question is a bit to your point, Rachel. Why are we not looking at the reasons why property owners are deciding to avoid putting their houses on longer term rentals? There is a reason here that is driving that behavior. And it's not just the ability to make a fast buck on the short-term rentals, because as I understand it from a lot of these people, it's getting harder to make money because these platforms are taking more and more of the fees and charges. The bottom line here is there are some fundamental reasons and inhibitors that are pushing people to put their properties on short stay rather than deal with the implications and complexities of long-term rentals. I keep coming back to, I feel like we're putting a Band-Aid on a really serious illness here, because we do not want to look microscopically at what is at the root cause of these problems that we're dealing with right now.
Rachel, care to comment?
Just something that it's been occurring to me as I've been looking at the research and delving into this issue a bit more is I wonder if one of the drivers for people to put their property on short stay accommodation is that they can't afford to buy and live where they want to buy and live. And so they buy in the regions because they want some housing assets, because in Australia we're so driven to have housing as a wealth generation tool, certainly, housing security point of view. So I think that there's a question there about, are people buying in the regions because they can't afford to buy in the cities, and then they don't want to live in the regions or they can't get work in the regions, and so then they put their place on short stay accommodation. So that way they try to have a foot in both camps. They try to be a property owner, but they need some income to come from that investment that they've made. I mean, I don't think anyone's talking about that. Is the affordability issue actually driving short stay accommodation rather than short stay accommodation driving the affordability? I'd be interested to know if that's why people are purchasing in the regions and converting that to short stay rental accommodation, because they want to own. And then if they're going to own a property not where they live, then maybe they want to be able to visit it on the weekends as well. So and I think we need to be able to talk about the sector, recognising the different types of investments. So there are some people who own a home that they want to retire into, but then there's other people who own 10 or 20 or more houses that they use for short stay accommodation, and they're really running like a business. And I think the levers, the incentives, or the disincentives will be different for those two groups. If you've got 20 houses and you're renting them out short stay accommodation, it might not take that much to encourage you to rent some of those out long stay if the I guess the incentives are there, or the disincentives to push you away. But for somebody who's got a holiday house, it's not going to change them. They're not going to rent it out long term because they want to be able to come and go. So being able to talk about that segmentation, and it's tricky because a lot of the platforms, they're not really open with the data that they have. So certainly that's the feedback I'm getting. They're getting better at it, but it's really hard to say, you know, these people own these houses for these reasons, and that, you know, that makes up X proportion. But even like really high-end properties, even if those high-end properties came into the long-term rental market and you were hoping for some kind of trickle-down effect, you know, somebody would rent this high-end one, which would free up a little bit less than high-end, which would free up one that's, you know, that we don't see that in housing markets. Housing as an asset is really, you know, it's really people don't move easily in and out of their investments when it comes to housing. It's expensive in terms of, you know, stamp duty and those sorts of things to transact your property.
So Brian, that theory that Rachel's put forward about why people make purchasing decisions in regional areas, as a regional mayor, does that resonate with you?
It does, and I'm glad you asked that question, Chris. I was about to jump in there with some economic data that we have, and it's on average the annual income for a short-term rental property in Hepburn Shire is $95,000 a year. In the Daylesford market, the rental on the long-term market, the returns would be $25,000 a year. Now, there's a massive difference and quite a very clear economic signal to a property owner that they can get $95,000 a year on the short-term market, $25,000 a year on the long-term market. It's a pretty clear choice.
So doesn't that support the government's position then that that's where the tax should and could apply?
And to what extent 7.5% will affect that remains to be seen. What will it do to solve the availability and affordability of housing? What are the unintended consequences then on the terribly important tourism and visitation market? This is a difficult scenario and problem that needs far more consideration to be well thought out before changes are implemented.
I think one of the other things when we start talking about income is, and this is again some of the feedback that we heard sort of anecdotally, is that the income may be much higher for short stay accommodation, but so are your outgoings. You need somebody to come in, and unless you're running it yourself, and which we did, you know, we know that there are some people who live in the same town and they have an extra, you know, a separate house, and they plenty of changing of the linen and all of those things themselves. But I think a lot of the conversation, if it's just on pure absolute revenue, then I think that doesn't necessarily reflect the outgoing costs. You know, the costs may be significant, I anticipate would be significantly higher for short stay accommodation. But I don't know, Felicia, whether there's been any research on that, or Brian, whether your stats reflected that.
I know anecdotally, because we talk with a lot of people that are in the short stay market, and in fact, I've got lots of friends that operate as well. You know, let's not forget there's also commission structures here. So while the revenue might be this big, the reality is that they're paying anywhere from 10 to 20% on some of the distribution channels that they're using. As you rightly talked about, the costs for cleaners to come in. Many of them actually engage people to market and promote. I know a number of my colleagues in Tassie that own properties, and there are companies now that have sprung up that actually basically pull all these properties together and market them for you. So they do all the selling and marketing and inventory management, but everybody's taking a clip of the ticket on the way through. So while that $95,000 sounds like a lot, that's not free and clear money. When you get down to the net, they are actually handing out an awful lot of money to run these properties. And that's why there are some, and I've talked to them as well, where they've just said, look, it's actually getting all just a bit too hard and I can't be bothered, so I'm going to offload the house. But I think to your point, Rachel, that's not putting those properties back into the rental market. That's actually putting it into, and yes, people might be activating first home buyer opportunities. So it is opening up housing availability, as you will, but it's not solving our rental crisis.
Thanks, Felicia. I want to get to potential alternatives and solutions here. Just a call to the audience. If you've got any questions, please pop them in now. Councillor Greedy, we'll take yours as a comment. There's not really a question in that. I think the panel's seen that. And please, panel, if you want to make a comment on that, feel free. Rachel, you've been doing some research about what's happening overseas. What lessons could we perhaps learn about alternative approaches from other places?
Yeah, it's been really interesting for me to start to look in the different jurisdictions, because a lot of my work over the last 5 years has been really focused in Australia. So it was nice to, I guess, pop my head up and look what's happening overseas, and looking specifically, I guess, in the US and in Europe as well. The European Union's brought in some regulation around this, but then individual countries and then individual regions within countries have also looked to control it. One of the things that strikes me, and we hear this in Australia as well, is that the drivers for regulation are not often housing availability and affordability. So that, or at least those are the sort of simmering underneath. But what really tips a jurisdiction over is, impacts on neighbours. So party houses, or one that seems to really, I guess, put a local government into action is the cost of waste disposal from short stay accommodation is significantly higher than the cost of waste disposal for long-term rental accommodation, because people who stay in short stay accommodation, they buy takeaway and they throw things away, or there's half a box of cereal left when they leave and they just throw it in the bin. So it's some of those really tangible things which seem to trigger an intervention, but the narrative around it is about, we don't want our towns overrun with tourists. We want enough housing so that the local teachers and their families got somewhere to live. And so I think there's a little disconnect about what pushes the change and then the narrative that comes to sort of support the change that sits underneath it, and what I've been seeing. And I guess the examples that we see overseas are similar to what we see in Australia. So a cap on number of nights. So there's examples in Australia of that happening as well. But that's really common in Europe and also in the States. A requirement for registration. So just saying that if you want to offer short stay accommodation, you have to be registered. And so they're the sorts of things that we start to see similar in Australia. But the other things that came up are things like requiring people who purchase homes to prove that they're local or have a local connection. So when a house comes on the market, you can't be living somewhere else and you buy it so that you can turn it into short stay accommodation. Only allowing short stay accommodation if you live in the dwelling on a permanent basis. So you're allowed to rent out your house if you go away for the summer, but you're not allowed to not live in that house. It has to be your primary dwelling. Setting the total number of short stay accommodation, I mentioned this at the beginning, for a particular location. And I assume that operates on a first in basis, like we're going to have 100 short stay accommodation. And then also specific authorisation if you want to use your property for short stay, like a planning permit, but also requiring authorisation from your insurer or your bank or your homeowners association. So really pushing the regulatory approach outside of local government. So it's saying, well, what's your bank have to say about this? The bank's holding the purse strings, so they can have a significant impact. And the research that I saw shows that if you implement a suite of requirements, it can have a significant impact on downward number of short stay accommodation, and that may help keep prices lower. But in all of it, they keep talking about this. If you're not going to monitor or undertake compliance or do enforcement of your regulations, then there's no point having them, because it creates this really uneven playing field. So if you say everybody has to be registered, and the people who want to be registered, want to do the right thing, they go and they jump through the hoops to get registered. But there's a whole suite of people who are like, I'm not going to be bothered to get registered. That's really disproportionate then, the impact on the people requiring registration. So
you're saying it sort of creates a black market, Rachel?
Not so much a black market. It's just there's no point bringing in regulations if you're not going to monitor and enforce them. But then like, who pays for the monitoring and enforcement? How do you fund an extra officer at local government level, or some extra people at state government level who like check, are you registered? Are you complying with the requirements of that registration? It can be expensive. And then to that point about to what benefit? So you've now implemented some more red tape, but have you actually created any additional housing? And what does that mean for the people who aren't playing by the red tape? You know, they sort of get to slide under the radar. Like, is registration, I think registration is useful for health and safety reasons. You know, we expect cafes to register and have their health license. But is a registration of an accommodation, like, again, what are you seeking to achieve? Are you trying to get better data? Are you trying to make sure that the people who register their accommodation meet the disability access standards, which is what we see in Europe? You know, that's been one of the things that's really pushed and pulled this short stay accommodation. And I think, again, keeping in mind the context of those jurisdictions where this impact has worked, they have really good housing support for people. So it's not as though they see this intervention into short stay accommodation as solving the housing problem. They're already trying to work on the housing, you know, making sure that people are well housed, and that there's good government support for that. The interventions tend to be more around, like, what does it mean for community cohesion? What does it mean for people being able to stay and remain in the communities that they were born, or whether they want to work in those? So if Australia was to go down the path and look at some of those international examples, my sense is that they wouldn't sit well in the Australian context, because Australian context, they prefer the market forces to determine it. They prefer some market intervention rather than, like, I can't imagine a conversation with the community where you say, like, the maximum number of short stay accommodation is 100 dwellings, like how that would play out. There's some interesting questions from a land use planning point of view. There's some good regulation there, but yeah, that's the sort of research that I've seen. But I'd be interested in the other panel members' comments on, particularly Felicia, if you've been looking at international examples, what you're seeing.
Yeah, look, I guess that was the point I made before, Rachel, that no jurisdiction overseas has relied on a single lever as we are doing. The only lever we're pulling here is a 7.5% tax. And in those jurisdictions where they have implemented a tourist tax, that tax is hypothecated in some extent or other back to the tourism industry. So this is a very, very different approach. And I think your comment about registration, I mean, clearly when you listen to the numbers and the discussion, we actually have no clear understanding of how many short stay properties are actually out there. There is also not a clear understanding of how many platforms are actually out there. This is not just about Airbnb and stays. Booking.com is in there, Expedia is in there, Agata is in there. You know, you've got TripAdeal. There's a whole range of different platforms now that are emerging that are doing whole single family dwellings that they're putting on their platforms. So to do this properly, number one, we actually need to understand what is the size of the universe. We don't understand that. And I think your points around compliance and how is this going to be monitored and measured? How do you ensure fair and equitable taxing of the population and fair and equitable collection and dispersal of that tax if we don't even have a clear handle on who should we be taxing?
Okay, I've got a final question for you all, but I want to deal with a couple of audience questions before I get to that. Firstly, Dale's raised the point, and I think I've read this somewhere, that the legislation being brought in by the state does put some preclusions on local government being able to impose charges or regulations, etc. Does anyone on the panel understand exactly what that entails? Because Dale's asking, why would this consumer charge actually conflict with councils being able to, for example, register landowners? Felicia, do you have an understanding of that, or Rachel?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, they're correct. And Brian, I was waiting for you to jump in there, because obviously this would be one near and dear to your heart. But as we understood it, when they launched the housing reform policy in September, they did say that this tax would now preclude the ability of local councils to further tax the short stay sector. Brian, do you want to jump in on that one? But that's my understanding.
Yes, that's our understanding too, that as a local council, we would be precluded from implementing any of our own regulations or charges in this area. And as I said earlier, that is particularly disappointing to us. We don't think that that's the right way of going about it.
Chris, could I also add, this is a little bit on the other side of the equation, not the local councils not being able to tax, but the question that I have raised with government is, does this impede on Victoria's share of GST? Because the GST legislation very, very clearly states that you cannot charge a bed tax. That language is actually in the GST regulations. I don't know, those on the call may not remember, but I was in Sydney in 1999 when they implemented a bed tax ahead of the Sydney Olympics, which was just a way of, grabbing money when we were going to have a whole lot of visitors in town. And they had that bed tax in for about a year, and then the GST was implemented. And the language in the GST was specifically written to preclude Sydney from continuing to maintain a bed tax. So that language is actually in the legislation. Now, unless somehow this 7.5% levy is going to be defined some way as not being a bed tax, which I struggle to find out how, that's the question that we've raised is, do we know if this is actually going to impact on Victoria's share of our GST as a consequence?
Interesting. All right. And Rob Haswell has asked how the government might manage exemptions. And he gives the example of someone who owns a commercial property and rents part of it out as short stay and lives in the other part of the building. Will the tax apply to commercial property as well as residential? Is anyone able to answer that one, or is that a bit too much in the detail?
No idea, but again, you think you'd be working this stuff out before you put the policy out there.
Rachel, did you have a comment there?
Just that I think that's exactly it. The devil's in the detail. And if you put in place something that's expensive to work through all of those exemptions, you have to wonder about whether the return is sufficient to cover your costs of, I don't know, checking everybody who applies for an exemption or those sorts of things. Yeah. A comment from Felicia about bed tax is interesting because that hadn't been front of mind for me, but I wonder if that's why government has linked it to affordable housing, so that they can say, oh no, this is clearly, there's this nexus between short stay and affordable housing, and that's why we need to do it. And then it avoids this conversation around bed tax. I think it's interesting that, because when I first saw the levy, I felt like, oh, this is like a bed tax. But then when I heard that the funding's going to Homes Victoria, I was like, well, then that feels really different from a bed tax, because normally it would go into infrastructure to, support infrastructure for tourism, including the tourism sector itself, but also infrastructure, like roads and sewage and all of those things that are needed. I don't know. Okay. I hope that it doesn't become so expensive to implement that you end up with, $3 million and then that's it at the end of the day.
All right. I noticed a couple of people starting to drop off because we have been going over the hour now, and it is, it is a lunchtime webinar. So I just want to ask each of you, in a perfect world, if you accept the link between rental housing availability and short stay accommodation, what would you like to see done to try and move the dial here? Felicia, as the tourism person here, what would be a reasonable response given that you've suggested this isn't?
That's a hard one, Chris, because, deep in my bones where I live, I'm incredibly opposed to this thing. I think it's a wrong idea. I do believe that we need to be thinking about the crisis on our hands with affordable housing, social housing, housing availability, but I just don't simply believe that this is the right answer. The only thing that I am asking for at the moment right now is, okay, we're saying this is the answer. We're saying it's going to generate $17 million. We're saying it's going to help us address the social housing and housing, well, not housing affordability, but more affordable housing. Where's the monitoring? I want to know in 12 months' time, 18 months' time. Let's have some post-analysis on all of this. Let's understand, are we actually achieving the goals we set out to achieve? Is this tax doing what it was intended to do? in its inception and in its formation. If you can tell me in 18 months' time that it's having an impact, I'll be impressed. I will be happy. I'll be very happy. But I would really question if we're going to be able to drive the kinds of results and change that have initially driven the thinking around this tax being implemented.
All right, we'll take that as your concluding comment, Felicia. Brian, a concluding comment from you. What do you think should be the approach?
I repeat what I said earlier, Chris, that more thought needs to be given into this topic. This is to us, this is a work in progress, and there needs to be genuine engagement with all stakeholders and certainly with local councils for such a deep problem on housing affordability and availability. I don't think there's one magic bullet solution. I don't think there's one solution that fits all. So I think there needs to be more thought put into this, genuine engagement with councils. There are clearly differences in metropolitan Melbourne compared to regional Victoria. They need to engage with us closely, and because there could be unintended consequences coming out of any actions that might be implemented, there needs to be more impact analysis done to say, well, if we do this, what will the consequence be? So that it's a much more measured approach. It all feels a bit rushed, and it all feels a bit too much one size fits all. And the proportion, the revenue proportion of the levy is one example of it. And people touched on before, the clarity is needed on how do you handle exemptions. What if it's a purpose-built premises for short-term accommodation? That's not taking anything out of the long-term rental market. How does it apply? There's so many unanswered questions here that need some more considered thought by a whole range of experts, and including with genuine consultation with councils.
Point well made, Brian. And Rachel, your concluding thoughts.
Until governments at all levels, but particularly state and federal, recognise housing as essential community infrastructure, we will always see these unintended consequences when individual sectors are targeted. So if the tourism sector, if we can get some revenue from that to spend on affordable housing, it'll be other sector. The construction sector, we get some from that, or the development sector. We don't tend to have conversations every year about whether we should or shouldn't spend some money on roads, whether we should or shouldn't spend some money on hospitals, whether we should or shouldn't spend some money on schools. But we still keep having this conversation about whether we should or shouldn't spend some money on affordable housing. And I think it's to do with the fact that housing feels individualistic, whereas those other public goods feel more public. But we know the evidence shows us that without a well-functioning housing system, including housing for vulnerable people or people who are priced out of the private market, your individual communities can't function. People can't do all of the other things that happen in communities. That means work, education, health, volunteering, all of those things. So I guess that would be my final comment, that let's start to treat housing, particularly affordable housing, as essential community infrastructure. And then we won't see these individual sector-based sources of income, or seeking sources of income, and all the unintended consequences that come from that.
Thank you all for what I think has been a terrific, wide-ranging and stimulating discussion. It's raised a few points perhaps that some people hadn't fully considered as well, and we really appreciate your insights today. So Rachel Hornsby, Felicia Mariani and Mayor Brian Hood, thank you so much. And for our audience, please stay with me while we just go through a couple of classified notices, if you don't mind. This panel has been part of a series of topics looking at the housing crisis in Victoria and its impact on local government. Coming up next is housing key workers. It's come up a couple of times in today's discussion, looking at Victorian towns and cities where in many parts of Victoria, workers are just unable to find affordable housing near their employment. We'll unpack that problem and hopefully look at some solutions, some of the things that are being tried at various places around the state. It's your last chance almost to get in for Fast Track on Civility in Local Government, which is happening in person next Friday at the RACV Club. If you enjoyed today's panel discussion, you've got a couple of them in fast succession as part of this program next Friday, as well as some workshop activity well worth your time and investment. Go to www.vlga.org.au for more information and to secure your place for those events. I'd also like to put in a quick plug for the podcasts that come from VLGA, VLGA Connect on YouTube and on your podcast player. If you're not subscribed, you're missing out on some terrific discussions and local government focused content. And then there's my podcast that I want to give a plug, the Local Government News Roundup, which is twice weekly. Lots of news from around the local government sector, not just in Victoria, but beyond. Subscribe to that one too while you're playing around in your podcast player. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining us and for submitting your questions. If you'd like to talk to us any further, please drop a note in the chat and we'll reach out to you after the event. And look out for the full recording of today's session coming very, very soon. The link will go out to all of our registered participants. So once again, to thank our panelists for being so generous with their time and thoughts, and to thank you for being a part of today's live panel webinar. Bye for now.